out of curiosity, how would you do a terrifying creature at night in the woods designed to be environmental encounter to show the party this creature is not to be messed with? Oh, I am so happy, because as you all know by now, I love horror. Now to do a terrifying creature we need 3 things: tension, mystery, and context. Let's tackle context first because it's something a lot of new DMs forget. In order to be scared of something, you have to have an idea of what that thing can do to you. So if you've seen Infinity War, this is why Thanos fights the Hulk at the beginning of the movie. Because at the beginning of the movie, we kinda have to be afraid of Thanos. As an audience, we have to perceive him as a threat. And since we know what the Hulk can do, he provides context for Thanos. So in a D&D campaign, we can do this in a number of ways. One way we can do this is through NPCs. If beforehand an NPC speaks about this terrible creature and is genuinely afraid, that helps provide context. You can provide this context environmentally by having a graveyard that your party runs across, and having people say, or the graveyard note, that all these people were killed by the same terrifying creature. Or, and this is my favorite method, the always a bigger fish method. You establish a creature that's already a threat, and then you have it be easily murdered by the even bigger threat. So let's say your party fights an owlbear, beats it, it's a little bit of a difficult fight, but they make it out okay. Then, as they're sitting in camp one dark night, they hear something. An owlbear maybe, it's hooting as it's coming towards the camp, then screeches, a creature's roar. Sounds of combat, then nothing. If the party goes to investigate, they see the owlbear in the jaws of this creature, or if they go in the morning to check it out, they see the body of the owlbear all mangled. And an NPC or a party member's knowledge can fill them in on what did this to the owlbear. And then they'll have the context of, okay, this was a hard enemy. It took us 3 rounds of combat to kill it, and we all got pretty hurt. This thing killed the owlbear in 6 seconds, which means if it gets a hold of any of us, we are completely dead. But let's also explore point number 2, mystery. There's gotta be a little bit of mystery around this creature because we are most afraid of what we do not understand. If you want to make this creature terrifying, don't let the party see the creature immediately. Better yet, I would run this encounter with the party only seeing glimpses of the creature. They don't know what this creature looks like, what it's capable of, or how they can beat it. The monster in your players' minds is always scarier than the monster you describe. Let their imaginations run wild as they try to figure out what this thing is. And you just smile, laugh, roll some dice, and generally act menacing or sadistic. Generally act like you know something that they don't, because you do. You know what this creature is, you know what it's capable of, and that's gonna worm inside the minds of your players a lot more. So whatever creature you're cooking up, make sure it's got some mystery to it. And finally, the third part, and this is the most important, tension. Tension is crucial for making a terrifying creature. You have to kind of marinate the party. Let them stew for a bit as you're going to build up this creature. You can do this through things like setting, like if they're in a dark forest at night, like I previously described. Or you can do this through NPCs that are terrified. But do you know how to build tension the best? It's actually by throwing in things that the party cannot explain. Things that don't make any sense, because great horror breaks the rules of the world. This kind of ties back into mystery. We can't make sense of what's going on in front of us. We can't use our superior intellect to combat that danger, so we become afraid. I like to add in calling cards to my creatures. Something weird that happens when a creature gets close, so the party instantly knows. Oh god, that terrifying thing is here. So Raiden, if I was you, let's say we're doing something in a dark forest at night. The party already knows that there's something here. We've provided them context. We've let them stew for a while. And then all of a sudden they smell like freshly baked bread. The smell is wafting through the dark forest at night, and the dark forest has all of a sudden gone completely silent. They hear no insects, they hear no birds. You could hear a pin drop. It is the strangeness that pulls us in. So when the terrifying creature eventually murders the owlbear, we know that it has a calling card. But we can do more with this idea, Raiden, because you said that you wanted this party to not mess with this creature. So after we've established it and we've gotten this calling card in, then let's say they're in the dark forest a few nights later. A few party members are talking to each other around dinner time, and then you just slip into the middle of the conversation, and man, the bread that's being baked smells amazing. Like you just tell a player that their character smells that freshly baking bread. Now, maybe most of your players don't catch on, but usually at least one remembers, wait a minute, didn't we smell bread during that, oh god, it's here! And then it's full-on panic mode as they realize there's no owlbear here this time. If this creature is hunting them or finds them, they're dead. And then in just 20 to 30 minutes of game time, Raiden, you can create a creature that will terrify your party for many levels to come. But that's with providing the right context, the right mystery, and the right tension. Next up, we have a question from CyberRift. I only play 5e and want to know your opinion. What is your number one pick for a new system to try out? Which one would be one that would allow me and my party to branch out, but is not too hard to jump into? Ooh, this is a big question, and I don't really know what your party's style is, so I'm gonna give you a few. I think if you're talking about an easy, generic game, then Monster of the Week is a great option. You go and you hunt monsters every single week. It's all about finding where the monster is, figuring out its secrets, and then beating the monster. The system is stupid easy to learn, and there are many different playbooks that the characters can use. And it's really easy to run games of Monster of the Week. I highly recommend it. Now, my favorite game outside of 5th edition is Band of Blades. This is a military horror fantasy game, and I think it's absolutely great. The premise in this game is this rolling retreat from an undead army, and over the course of a campaign, you and your players essentially try and build up for the final fight. The game system is action-packed, easy to learn, and comes with this pre-built world and story that I adore. And even at the back of the book, it gives you a guide on how to adapt it for a sci-fi setting or for your own custom homebrewed world, which I think is just fantastic. Band of Blades is one of the best books written for game masters out there. These are designers who know what it's like to be a game master and what game masters need to run an effective game. The system is honestly awesome. My only reservation with recommending it to people is the group has to be willing to engage in the management of the actual company that you're a part of for the military. And if your players don't want to engage with that, then things fall a bit flat. For more generic campaigns though, the Fate system is fantastic. The Fate core rule system is so flexible and adaptive, it really deserves its own video. But if you're looking for something with the flexibility of D&D 5th edition, that kind of gets out of the way and lets you run the stories you want to run, Fate is great. But it's never going to match up to RPGs that have a dedicated vibe. And if you're looking for an RPG that's just for a one-shot to dip your toes into what the genre can be, a game like Microscope or Dread that push the bounds of what an RPG could be, I highly recommend. Microscope is an RPG about making your own campaign world and history, while Dread uses a Jenga tower instead of die rolls. If you knock over the Jenga tower in the middle of a session, your character dies. Both systems are fantastic for one-shots. So I hope you can find something in all of those recommendations, but if you have a specific vibe for a campaign, then leave that in the comments below, CyberRift, and maybe I can pin down an even better match for you. Because while I love D&D 5th edition, there are so many other systems that are honestly better fits for most groups. Alright, moving on to the next question. This is not a question. This is starting off so good, but kinda a request. Can we see a video watching you prep? Like, how do you prep the campaign? I know you build the world before pitching it to your players, but do you make the central plot as well? Or do you wait for the player to give you their backstories before you descend into your 3-arc structure? And how do you prepare for the upcoming session? What things do you prep? So I've always considered a video of me just prepping for the average session, but I've had 2 reservations. One, I don't know how interesting I could make it. It would either be long periods of silence as I'm thinking about things, or me cutting a video together and you don't get to see the overall experience of what I'm doing. So I'm not sure how I would do that. I kind of leave it up to you guys in the comments a little bit. Would you just want raw video of me flipping between Google Docs and campaign notes, or something a bit more concise? And then there's the issue of my players, because I trust them a lot, but do I trust 34 out of 34 players not to ever look at the video? That's a difficult ask. So it has to be the right session when all my world information isn't put into my actual session notes, and when I'm not looking at really sensitive topics that if they saw them would be like, oh, you've just spoiled something 5 years down the line. But I want to get into more of your specific questions. So the central plot of my campaign is built into the pitch. Or really I should say the central tension. It's the situation or the idea that the campaign is revolving around. Mind you, that central idea can change as play progresses, but I usually have something in mind. Like in one of my campaigns that was titled The Crimson Storm. The central idea of the campaign was to stop this world event called the Crimson Storm that was being created by the first vampire. That was the central plot of the campaign, and I knew it would be the central plot of the campaign as players were signing up for it. Now, I do wait for my players to give me their backstories before I really start descending into the 3-arc structure. I can do my large campaign arc before backstories. A few checkpoints or keys that I kind of foresee happening as the story progresses. Like for the Crimson Storm, one of those key events was finding out who the actual villain was. The entire first 10 sessions were basically built around teasing the villain and then the players getting around to figuring out who the villain is of this entire campaign. Now I ask you, is it railroading to figure out? Yeah, they're probably going to figure out who the villain is at some point, so I'm gonna build some plot events around that assumption. I say not really. But once I start getting player backstories, I can dive into my planning for different arcs. For my medium arcs, my narrative arcs, I break them down into 10 to 12 session seasons. It's easier to keep it in my mind that way when I can think, alright, I'm in season 3 of this campaign. And it helps provide structure to the central narrative. But when I get player backstories, I can start weaving them into that central narrative. And I can look at my planning and go, well, I haven't really added in a lot of this player's backstory yet. So I need to add in more plot hooks for them in season 1 so we can explore their backstory or get those concepts in that they're looking for. And how do I prepare for the upcoming session? Well, it really just comes down to rolling over what I can from previous session notes and previous session prep. And then making sure I have at least one combat, one place they can go prepared, and rolling from there. Now, if the session is going to be a boss fight, I plan differently than if the players are having a downtime session. Sometimes I think of them as like chore sessions, where players have a lot of things they want to do, and occasionally I give them time to check off their chore list. But really, the question of what things do I prep varies from session to session. This is a terrible answer, but it's whatever the session needs. Like if last session was really heavily combat focused, the next session might be more roleplay focused. So I'm prepping NPC backstory reveals or fun RP events to happen. Like the circus has come to town, or the local tavern that the party loves to frequent is having their annual drinking contest. But it really depends, and I think you're right that I can only really get across what I'm doing if I show you in some way. I just don't know how to show you yet. The next question though is from Joao Silvia from Portugal. And honestly, I love it when you guys tell me where you're from, because I've been to a lot of places like Germany or Britain, Poland, the Baltic states, Greece, Italy, Turkey, and world travel and cultures really interest me. So yeah, Joao, thank you for telling me that you are from Portugal. And now your question, where do you get the inspiration to run 7, I'm assuming homebrew, yes they are homebrew, campaigns? I sometimes lack the inspiration to make a single adventure, let alone a campaign arc. Some DMs resort to books with random tables. Do you resort to that as well? I can tell you right off the bat, no. If you do you have any book recommendations? I'm very curious to know about your creative process. So yes, I run 7 homebrew campaigns a week. No, I do not resort to books or tables. Or if I do resort to them, they are books or tables that I have created for myself. And I love this question because a lot of new DMs say this to me. They say, well, how do you get inspiration for all of these campaigns? And I say that creativity is a muscle. You train your creativity the exact same way that you train your pectoral or your bicep. Or it's like practicing an instrument. The more often you train that creative muscle, the easier it is for you to descend into that creative space. So for me, I am always looking for ideas. All the time I'm looking around and trying to find cool moments or experiences or things that inspire me. My phone and my Google Drive are filled with folders that contain just ideas and ideas and ideas. Because whenever a stray idea pops into my head, I just write it down somewhere. And then if I'm feeling stuck, I just turn to those ideas. I'll be honest, campaigns are the hardest things to think up for me, so I have a huge document with campaign ideas. Some ideas are expansive and others are just a few sentences, but they're just things that jog my creative process. And I never end my creative sessions on a period, and I want to kind of explain this more. There should always be something that you can easily jump into when you go back into that creative space. So, if I'm fleshing out a campaign world and things are going really good, it is at that point that I rip cord out because I know that I will be able to come back into that experience and continue being creative. That idea and that space is still fertile for me to work with. So if I'm world building a country's history, I don't stop when I've finished world building that country's history. Because if I did, when I sat down next, I would have to jump in cold turkey. So I either keep going or rip cord out of that session before I reach that end point. This is something I do in campaigns as well. Like I just say something that doesn't really connect but sounds interesting. Like I just ran a session today where an NPC who is an oracle told a player, hey, beware the orange eyes. I'm gonna be honest, I have no idea what orange eyes they need to beware of. That was completely thrown out there out of nowhere. To this point, no NPCs or creatures have orange eyes. But you know what? It's in my notes of potential plot hooks. And I didn't end that idea on a period. So I can come back around later if I'm stuck and go, okay, I have this out here. What are the orange eyes all about? And I can start working from there. But apart from this little creative hack, it's really just training myself to go into that creative space. So when I start prepping for a campaign or need to be creative, I just more easily can get into that space because I've practiced it. Because I'm used to being creative more often. And that's kind of the trick, Joao. Eventually you just get used to making these new ideas. And I'll be honest, players cannot tell in session when the ideas were hard fought and I really had to try for that prep session because I had nothing going on, versus when the words flow like water and I'm coasting on cloud 9 for 3 hours. Literally no one can tell the difference because the creativity is the same. The difference between you at your best creatively and you at your worst creatively is fractional. No one can tell the difference unless they're inside your head. So it really just comes down to time and practice and training your brain to be creative. Next up though, we have Stargate Mind. Question 1. What can publishers provide to limit the frenzy of players who do not know the things you and I do? This is a tough one. I don't know what you mean by know the things that you and I do. Because honestly, my viewers know collectively a lot more than me. I'm always concerned about missing something in my analysis. So honestly, I don't think publishers should provide anything because do we really know better than everyone else? I don't think so. Like, of course, there are takes that I look at and I'm like, that is stupid. I have no idea why you think that. But I don't think publishers can really limit those takes. I think they just kind of happen. And then you have a second question is, what can the problem seekers do to find the millions of answers already provided? Well, one, you can look up YouTube videos like mine. The second route is going and seeking, third-party sources that help guide you along the process, like The Return of the Lazy DM is a book that so many people have read. I think it has a lot of helpful tips in it, and players and dungeon masters can find those resources if they really want to. But there is a third avenue that is by far the best, and this is what I've learned the most from. The easiest way to find answers to a million of your questions is to go to your local game shop, if you have one. I know they're a dying breed nowadays, but I swear, those game shops and the people within it have so much more knowledge. These are people who are dedicated to the hobby and have years, if not decades, of information stored within their own heads. And you have people inside the game shop that disagree and can give you both sides of an argument. If the culture is really good in that game store, you can walk away from both individuals thinking, yeah, I can see either side. You might lean one way or another, but nobody has given you a crack-ass crazy take. So I suppose if you're trying to find these solutions to the problems, that's what I think you mean by problem seekers, then you go the internet, third-party sources, game shops. Now, I would personally take all social media sites with a grain of salt, so that means places like Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and more. Some of those communities can be real echo chambers, and a lot of bad advice is spouted all the time, from people who aren't playing the game often or who haven't played the game enough to see the flaws in what they're recommending. An example of this, in my mind, is telling DMs not to worry about hit points, or encouraging the changing of hit points of creatures and enemies during combat. I have seen it go wrong so many times, and it degrades the trust between the dungeon masters and the players. And as soon as players know, it can sometimes destroy gaming tables, because certain players, and to an extent myself included, think that if the DM can just decide when combat is over arbitrarily, based on nothing that the players actually do, then the game loses a lot of meaning. At least combat loses all meaning. And while I don't think it loses all meaning, not faithfully tracking hit points in combat, not caring about the hit points of your creatures, just ending combats whenever, in my opinion, is really bad advice. But people on Reddit love that advice. That's A+ material for them. Even though the first time I saw this advice, I think it was 7 years ago, and it was a Reddit post about someone who said that they were running a D&D club in their elementary school, and they walked up to a young kid, and they asked why they weren't tracking hit points, and the young kid said, "Oh, the battle stops when it stops being fun." And after that, I saw the advice get popular. I'm not sure if it's directly from that post, but a gut feeling tells me posts like that are what got the advice to be popular. And one, while children are smarter than we give them credit for, don't take DMing advice from a 10-year-old as gospel. And two, the advice fails if your players ever catch on, because if they catch on, you're fucked. Maybe you're at a magical table where every single player is going to be okay with you fudging hit points and fudging die rolls. After 12 years and almost 100 campaigns and so many systems, I have not seen it. So I think that's terrible advice, and maybe that's the thing we have to tell new DMs and new players. Don't take advice from social media as gospel. Go to different sources, because I'll be honest, a lot of the big creators on YouTube, yeah, they give some pretty solid advice. And if Matt Koval or WebDM or Jenny D or the Dungeon Dude say something, yeah, you're probably gonna be good if you follow that advice. Okay, now I want to move into some random comments that weren't submitted for this video, but I think are important to talk about nevertheless. Like this one from Husky Passion, who says, "How can you forget stuff as a player? You literally have only 5 things to remember at best." And I translated this comment a bit, but I think the underlying sentiment is, as a player, how can you forget only one character sheet when the DM has to remember the world, the creature stat blocks, the NPCs, the story, etc.? And it's because players are human. Everybody forgets things during games. As Dungeon Masters, we actually forget things all the time. It's just that we can cover up our mistakes and nobody will know, because it was part of our plan all along. But for players during the heat of your moment, on your turn, in a difficult or intense combat, yeah, you're just gonna forget things. Or maybe your character sheet is the size of a doctoral thesis, and you just happen to forget that you have a certain spell that would easily solve this combat encounter. That shit happens all the time. And it happens because we're human. I don't try and build combat encounters, and I haven't for the last decade, based around an ability that I know one player has, because it is inevitable that that player will forget about that ability. Early on in my DMing career, I built a boss battle centered around the paladin of the party. And that boss monster was specifically vulnerable to radiant damage. Here I am thinking that this level 3 paladin is going to smite them into oblivion and I get to give them this great moment. The boss almost ends up TPKing the party because the paladin player just forgot that they had smite. It was after a long day, they were stressed, and they just forgot until like the last round that they could actually use smite. And it was the first paladin that they had ever played. So while some of you might call that insane and it's totally the player's fault, no. Complete wrong mindset. That's the fault of me as a dungeon master. Because if rule 0 is that the dungeon master has final say, then rule -1 is that the players will forget something important. Now today I've learned my lesson and I don't build encounters like that anymore, even for veteran players who have characters that are 18th level, because everybody forgets eventually. Now, if you're a friendly dungeon master and the player is new or they just got a new character, then you can help walk them through their character sheet. Like you could remind them, hey, you can smite this turn if you want. Or saying you still have an action surge or a second wind, and making sure that they're not forgetting their abilities. But in my opinion, it's not only a part of the game, but it's a part of life that people will forget things. And this last comment was left on my damage calculation video, which is the sequel to my first ever video that I released on the channel. And this comment is bringing up a few concerns about my encounter design method. But this comment has so many encounter design lessons in it that I have to talk about it. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. I think this calculation might work for higher level parties, but could be problematic at lower levels, where the players don't have nearly unlimited healing available. If a solo boss is dropping a character or even cutting them in half with a single blow, the player's action economy starts to shrink very rapidly. A recent example from a game I'm in, our 5-member 3rd level party, average HP is in the mid to upper 20s, had to fight a solo boss that had a better AC than 60% of the party, was dealing out 2d10 plus 6 damage, average 17, per attack, and took around 160 points of damage to kill. The average damage per hit that the party was capable of dealing was probably between 7 and 10 points. We ultimately won the fight, but quite frankly, I think the DM fudged things to avoid killing us. The combat, because of how much damage it took to kill the thing, wasn't memorable. It felt like a grind, and not a particularly fun one at that. I don't know if a grind is ever fun. Halfway through the fight, the group was feeling pretty disheartened because we'd thrown pretty much everything we had at the thing and it just kept going and going and going. It was also getting layer action, so we were constantly dealing with environmental effects, giving it an action economy that was on par with that of the party. So it having a better AC, higher damage per hit, more hit points, and the same action economy just felt rough. It probably didn't help that the scenario called for closing off any avenues of escape at the beginning of the fight, so retreating to regroup was taken away as an option. So there is a ton to unpack here. So before diving into this, I want to recap a few basic premises of my encounter design method. Firstly, the total enemy hit points should generally equal the party's hit points. Secondly, the action economies of both groups should be about equal. And for a solo boss, it should be doing anywhere between 35% to 45% of a character's total hit points per attack, and the solo boss should output about 120% of one character's hit points per round. So we're wanting a boss monster whose hit points are on par with the rest of the party, and whose attacks, if necessary, could down one party member a round, but ideally we're spreading the attacks around a little bit. That way we're putting pressure on multiple party members and making the fight feel dynamic. And also it prevents any one player from feeling focus fired, because if the boss monster dumps all its attacks into one character round 1 downing them, well, that player might feel a bit targeted. So with those points out of the way, looking at this initial encounter, my reaction is that the balancing was way off. Let's assume that each party member has 25 hit points on average. And I have to say, this is very high for an average party. This means that most of the party are using D10 hit die and are rocking with +2 to their con modifiers. So we probably don't have any dedicated spellcasters like wizards or sorcerers, or rogues or monks or druids. But honestly, this doesn't really change things about our calculation. So 5 level 3 PCs with an average of 25 hit points each is 125 total hit points between them. So already we know that 160 hit points for a boss monster is way too much. Especially at level 3 where bounded accuracy makes every single hit point more important. If you're 15 to 20% off from your designated mark, of course you're going to feel it in combat. If you're almost 30% away from where you should be, yeah, that's going to be a bit of a problem. And then we look at the creature doing 17 points of damage per attack. That means it's doing about 70% of a character's total hit points, which is way too high. And then a third level party doing anywhere between 7 to 10 damage on average seems a tad low, because something like a first level magic missile is going to be doing about 11 points of damage on average. But this is DM and party dependent, so let's rock with the 7 to 10 average damage range. Using my encounter design rules, ideally we're going to want to give our boss monster 120 to 130 hit points. And by the way, like I've said multiple times, encounter design is more an art than a science, and you really kind of have to feel out your party. So if your party doesn't output a lot of damage, then you decrease the number of hit points that you give your boss monster. The party dictates how much. However, in this case, an average of 8 damage per round is about 40 damage per round, multiplying that by 3, and we're almost exactly at 3 rounds of combat, which is a sweet spot. Each character is getting multiple turns to do something, and it's not dragging out forever, ideally. Then, if we look at the creature's damage, we're trying to do 120% of a character's hit points in a round over the course of all the attacks. So then we're looking at 32 points of damage across 5 attacks. Now, I would probably bump that up to 12 damage per attack across 3 attacks so it feels a bit more natural. But that means we're doing roughly 100 damage across 3 rounds, which is a lot, but it's not nearly enough to kill a party, especially if a party has any amount of healing. And this is assuming that you're going into a boss fight fully rested, prepared. If you're building a dungeon or a gauntlet before your boss fight that's intended to weaken the party, yeah, like I say in the videos, you're going to scale this back a little bit. If the party's collective hit points are 80 when they reach the boss room, maybe this boss only has 80 hit points. The lives of their characters will be in danger if you put it at a full 125 hit points. So we adjust and we tweak here and there. And then discussing the high AC, I don't actually know enough to see if that's a problem or not. If these are all fighters and barbarians that are crowding a creature and getting advantage hitting on every attack, that high AC might have been necessary to not trivialize the combat. Maybe that's what the DM thought. But even still, 160 hit points were just way too much. And I feel really sorry for this commenter because, yeah, it sounds like this combat would be a grind. But when we sit down and actually do the math, what I'm actually suggesting and what is happening in this combat encounter aren't anywhere close to the same thing. And I'm not trying to attack this commenter at all, because I think it's important to walk through these things so that we can learn and understand. A lot of new DMs have come to me and said, well, I tried this system, but it was either too weak or too strong. So then I sit down with them and I compare their combat encounter to how I would have built the combat encounter. And thus far, 95% of the time, the combat encounter they show me just doesn't follow the math. This system is partially a final check. You look at the enemy's HP, you look at the party's HP. Are they close? Good. Look at the damage. Are you doing an average of 120% of the average character's hit points over the course of a round? You are? Fantastic. You're going to challenge them, but you're not going to kill them. Is the action economy generally equal? It is. Fantastic. Because you gotta apply the encounter building principles. With bounded accuracy, small changes in the numbers can have massive effects. Maybe a 20 to 30% change doesn't sound like a lot to you. I promise in 5th edition it's massive. The difference between a regular longsword and a +4 longsword is 20%. A +4 longsword would be a legendary weapon that you get at epic levels of play. So 20% is a whole damn lot. Especially for big fights, especially for boss encounters. Double check your math. Double check the numbers. Make sure that if your party is playing flat out average, that they at least have a mathematical chance to kill that creature. And you know, if they score 5 criticals round 1 and toast that thing, whatever. That's just what the dice wanted to happen. But you know what? The moment is going to be epic. The most important thing though is getting enemy health and enemy damage percentages right. If the enemies have the right amount of health and the right damage, you're probably fine. In this encounter, you guys see what happens when the enemy health and the damage percentages are off. Players feel like it's a grind because it's too much health, and that it's way too deadly because of too much damage. And then, you notice how in there they snuck in that the DM might have fudged some die rolls? That's another thing that's really scary, because if you, as a player, think the DM is keeping me alive and we should have all died, then why are they gonna feel threatened during another combat encounter ever again? Because at some level they just might be thinking, oh, the DM's gonna bail us out of this. And you know what? Maybe the DM did goof in this combat encounter, and they're trying to fudge die rolls and mess with HP so that they can keep the players alive because they fucked up. But another secondary side effect that I don't often see talked about is that players stop recognizing when you fucked up and when they fucked up. Because if these situations become the norm, then when they wander into the den of an ancient red dragon and they start getting their asses kicked, they think, this is just business as normal. We're just gonna get pulled out of this. We don't know how we're gonna live, but you know what? It's probably gonna be fine. We made it through all the other times. Wait, what do you mean we TPK'd? This happens a lot, and at the back of my mind, whenever I hear about a dumb TPK story, I'm always thinking, you know, did the DM set them up for this TPK because they were fudging die rolls and hit points? Did the players actually just think that this is business as usual? And that when things in combat started going south, they were just gonna pull out of it like they always did? I know it's impossible, but I would love to learn the actual statistics of how often that occurs. And what percentage of TPKs are from DMs training players to expect that these dangerous situations are going to work out fine. It's actually for this reason that for every new group of players within the first 10 to 15 sessions, I make sure that there's a combat where they will likely fail. I don't want to say mathematically fail because there's always a chance they can win, and the combat is close enough where theoretically with perfect play they could pull it out. But I'm using all my thousands of hours of experience in DM war training to target them, and playing the enemies like I would if my life was on the line. Like if I didn't reduce every player to 0 hit points and make them unconscious, Asmodeus was going to rise up from the 9 hells, grab me by the throat, and rip me down into Avernus. And these are always scenarios where a party is captured, or the villains have a great reason for letting them live. But I'm trying to introduce parties to the idea that they can fail and that they are not gods. Because as soon as the party thinks of themselves as gods, they turn into goldfish and jump off cliffs. They turn into lemmings and lose all sense of self-preservation. So while it might be controversial, I think controlled failure is very important. So War Spaniel, thank you for this amazing comment, because there's a lot that I think we can pull out of it. And you know what? Maybe my calculation is problematic for lower level parties. I have not discounted that idea, because while it might work for me at all levels, it might not work for the average dungeon master. I think that it's important to open myself up to criticism and recognize I might be wrong. I don't think in this situation that I am, but I leave all of you to be the judges of that. And if this is a cautionary tale that you can learn from, which is a failure of my system, then do it. I encourage it. Because at the end of the day, I want all of you to go out and run the best campaigns that you can, be the best players in other people's campaigns that you can, and have the most fun. Because TTRPGs at the end of the day are a game, and they are designed to bring joy and happiness to your life. Anything else is honestly gravy. Woo! I'm gonna end this recording at under 3 hours, which is awesome, because previous videos have been hours and hours and hours long. I think I've gotten more concise over time. Hopefully still providing good information for all of you though. And this is 100% going to be a new series, because honestly, I have so much information up in this noggin of mine that I'm just always struggling to figure out what is the thing I convey to you guys next. What's the piece of information that is going to make your game better? But you guys just asking me the questions that you want to know is so much easier. And now there's enough of you where I can actually start answering all of those questions. And I'm not so big that I can actually answer all of them in the amount of detail that I want to. I want to give you all full and complete answers and also have the opportunity for you to come back, tell me if the advice worked, where things go wrong, ask follow-up questions if you want them, and know if you pose a question, I'm eventually going to answer the question. So I think these videos will be coming out every Thursday or Friday. That feels extremely doable for me. And even though recording these videos takes so long, the actual editing of them is very short. And I'm assuming most of you are listening to this as kind of like a podcast anyway. So hopefully the vibes are still good. Now if you missed the first Q&A, or whatever this series is now called, check out this video right here. It's the video that started it all. And thank you for entering the dungeon.